Bone forest. The first thing we noticed was the silence. Not the usual quiet you expect when you're out in the woods, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that clung to everything, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It didn't help that the trees looked the way they did, their trunks a pale, bone-like white, with jagged ridges and knots that almost resembled joints. It wasn't natural, that much was obvious. But when Dylan found the trail on some obscure hiking forum, none of the reviews mentioned anything strange, just a hidden gem for those who loved adventure. It started as a joke, really. The Bone Forest, Mandy called it, snapping photos of the eerie trees with her phone. She was always the one trying to make things lighter, even when her jokes felt forced. Dylan, as usual, took the lead with his trusty map and compass, acting like we were scaling Everest instead of trudging through a forest in the middle of nowhere. Luis carried the gear, grumbling about how he got stuck with all the heavy stuff, while Dylan strutted ahead with his lightweight pack. And me? I was the reluctant tag-along, more interested in surviving the weekend than proving anything to anyone. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing that seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. The trees encircled us like sentinels, their twisted forms casting long, skeletal shadows as the sun dipped lower. I tried not to stare at them too much, but it was hard to ignore how they seemed off. Like their bark wasn't just textured but veined, almost as if something pulsed beneath the surface. Luis noticed it too, muttering something about how the trees looked like they were made of cartilage. Mandy told him to quit freaking everyone out, but her laugh was shaky. That first night, we built a fire and tried to keep things normal, roasting marshmallows, swapping ghost stories, the usual campfire cliches. But the silence swallowed everything. Our voices didn't carry, and the crackle of the fire felt muted. Even the stars above seemed dimmer, their light struggling to pierce the thick canopy of bone-white branches. It wasn't until we lay down to sleep that the real unease set in. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound that I can only describe as crunching. Like someone snapping dry twigs, but slower and wetter, if that makes sense. I sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the clearing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering light on the surrounding trees. They looked closer somehow, their gnarled limbs reaching inward like skeletal fingers. I told myself it was my imagination, that the sounds were just animals or the wind, but deep down, I knew better. There was no wind. There hadn't been since we'd arrived. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by animals, but by the forest itself. When morning finally came, Dylan was already up, poking at the embers with a stick and acting like nothing was wrong. Mandy was scrolling through her phone, complaining that she couldn't get a signal. Luis looked like he hadn't slept at all, his face pale and drawn. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked me, his voice low. I nodded, not wanting to say too much in front of the others. We decided to keep moving, hoping the trail would eventually loop back toward civilization. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead in a way that felt suffocating. The ground beneath our feet wasn't just dirt anymore, it was soft, almost spongy, like we were walking on something alive. And the crunching sound, it didn't stop. It followed us, distant at first, but steadily growing louder, like whatever was making it was matching our pace. Mandy tried to lighten the mood again, cracking jokes about how we'd stumbled into the set of some horror movie, but her laugh was even more forced than before. Dylan stayed focused on the trail, his jaw clenched and his usual bravado noticeably absent. Luis, on the other hand, was jumpy, spinning around at every sound, his eyes darting to the shadows. By the time we stopped to set up camp again, the tension was unbearable. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing: something wasn't right with this forest. It wasn't just the trees, or the silence, or the way the air felt heavier with each passing hour. It was something deeper, something we couldn't see but could feel, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. That night, the crunching was louder. Closer. And this time, it wasn't just me who heard it. Dylan was the first to say something, though he kept his voice low, almost a whisper. "Did anyone else hear that?" His words broke the fragile silence, and the rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Mandy tried to brush it off, but her hands trembled as she tightened the straps on her sleeping bag. Luis didn't even bother pretending he was okay. "It's not just the trees," he said, his voice barely above a croak. "There's something out there." I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, that we'd all been spooked by the creepy atmosphere and our imaginations were running wild. But I couldn't. The crunching wasn't just a sound anymore, it had rhythm. Deliberate, uneven steps. Too slow for an animal. Too heavy for the wind. It circled the camp, never venturing into the firelight but always just at the edge of our hearing. We huddled closer to the fire, even as the embers started to fade. Dylan insisted we keep it burning, throwing what little wood we'd managed to gather onto the flames. But the forest wasn't exactly generous with kindling. The trees didn't drop branches like normal ones, and the bark was too smooth, or too slick, to peel away. Luis was the first to snap. "Screw this," he said, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "I'm not sitting here waiting for whatever that is to make its move. I'm going to check it out." "Don't be stupid," Dylan snapped, but Luis ignored him, stomping off into the darkness before anyone could stop him. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, casting eerie shapes onto the trees. For a moment, the crunching stopped, and I thought maybe he'd scared off whatever was out there. But then the sound returned, louder this time. Closer. Luis froze, his light trembling as it flicked from tree to tree. "It's nothing," he said, his voice shaking. "Just the damn trees. They're making noise or something." But even as he said it, we all knew it wasn't true. The sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the ground. Before any of us could react, Luis screamed, a raw, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. His flashlight fell, spinning wildly as it hit the ground, and for a brief moment, its beam illuminated something. Something pale and jointed, like the skeletal branch of a tree, but moving. Reaching. We bolted. All of us. Dylan grabbed Mandy, dragging her along as she screamed for Luis. I snatched the flashlight, barely daring to glance back at the clearing. I caught a glimpse of Luis, just a blur of motion, his body jerking as something pulled him into the shadows. And then he was gone. We ran blindly through the forest, the crunching sound chasing us, growing louder with every step. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the pale trunks that loomed all around us. I couldn't tell if we were going deeper into the forest or if it was leading us somewhere, drawing us in like flies into a web. Eventually, we stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. Dylan was the first to speak, his voice raw and panicked. "We have to go back. We can't just leave him." But none of us moved. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Going back felt like walking straight into its jaws. Mandy was sobbing, clutching at Dylan's arm. "He's gone," she choked out. "You saw what happened. There's nothing we can do." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Dylan didn't respond. He just stared into the darkness, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. For the first time since we'd started this trip, he looked lost. Helpless. The crunching had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was thick and suffocating, pressing down on us like a tangible force. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. And then, in the distance, we heard it. A faint, muffled sound. A voice. Luis's voice. He was calling for help. Mandy's head snapped up, her eyes wide with hope. "He's alive," she cried, starting toward the sound. But Dylan grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Wait," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Listen." We fell silent, straining to hear. The voice was faint, but it was there, repeating the same word over and over, "Help." It didn't sound right. The tone was flat, mechanical, like a recording being played on a loop. And it wasn't coming closer. It stayed in one spot, just out of reach, like it was baiting us. Mandy hesitated, her hope flickering like a dying ember. "What if it's him?" she whispered. Dylan shook his head. "It's not," he said firmly. "Whatever that is, it's not Luis." We didn't argue. We didn't need to. Deep down, we all knew he was right. The forest was toying with us, drawing us deeper into its grip. But we had no choice. We couldn't stay in one place, not with whatever had taken Luis still out there. So we kept moving, our nerves frayed, our bodies exhausted. The voice followed us, growing fainter as we put more distance between us and the clearing. But the forest itself seemed to shift, the trees twisting and leaning closer, their skeletal limbs reaching for us like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. I kept waiting for the crunching to return, but the silence was almost worse. It was as if the forest was holding back, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, guided towards something we couldn't see but could feel in our bones. Something that was waiting for us, just beyond the next bend. The flashlight's beam flickered, threatening to die, but Dylan smacked it just in time to keep it alive. It was our only tether to sanity, a thin thread holding back the crushing blackness that pressed in on every side. Mandy was stumbling, her sobs reduced to shallow, panicked breaths. I could feel the weight of the forest bearing down on us, like it was alive and hungry, and we were trespassers it wanted to consume. The voice, Luis's voice, kept drifting toward us, faint and fragmented, as though carried by an invisible wind. "Help," it repeated, again and again, the same flat, soulless cadence that sent chills crawling down my spine. Each time we thought it was fading, it would return, a little closer, a little sharper, until it felt like it was whispering directly into our ears. "I swear it's not him," Dylan muttered under his breath, his voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. He had always been the steady one, the rock of our group, but now his confidence was cracking, and that scared me more than anything. "It's just, this place. It's messing with us." Mandy wasn't listening. She jerked her arm out of Dylan's grip and spun toward the sound, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What if it is him?" she whispered, desperation dripping from every word. "We can't just leave him. We can't." "Mandy, stop!" Dylan hissed, lunging to grab her, but she had already bolted into the darkness, her silhouette swallowed by the pale trees. "Mandy, no!" I shouted, my voice echoing eerily through the forest. Dylan and I didn't hesitate, we took off after her, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. Every shadow looked like it was reaching for us, and the trees seemed to close in, their skeletal branches clawing at our clothes and hair. The sound of Mandy's footsteps was frantic, erratic, but always just ahead, leading us deeper into the unknown. Then she screamed. It was a sound that cut through the air like a knife, raw and primal, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. Dylan surged forward, his grip on the flashlight tightening until his knuckles turned white. The beam finally found her, and for a moment, I wished it hadn't. Mandy was standing in a clearing, her body rigid, her eyes wide with horror. She was staring at something I couldn't make sense of at first. The ground in front of her was covered in what looked like roots, but they were pale and segmented, curling and twisting like tendons pulled from a living body. And in the center of it all was a figure. It was Luis. Or at least, it looked like him. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes blank and glassy. His skin was deathly pale, almost blending into the color of the trees around him. And his mouth was moving. "Help," he said, the word empty and mechanical, like a puppet being forced to speak. "Help. Help." Mandy took a step forward, her trembling hand reaching out toward him. "Luis," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is it really you?" Dylan grabbed her arm, pulling her back with more force than I thought he was capable of. "Don't," he growled, his voice low and urgent. "That's not him, Mandy." Look at him. Look. She fought against him, but then her gaze shifted, and she saw what we all saw. Luis's feet weren't touching the ground. The pale, twisted roots beneath him were wrapped around his ankles, his legs, his torso, holding him upright like a marionette. They pulsed faintly, as though something was flowing through them, and with each pulse, his mouth moved again. Help. It was the same word, but now it sounded warped, distorted, like a recording being played backward. Dylan yanked Mandy away, and we stumbled back into the forest, leaving the clearing, and whatever was left of Luis, behind. The flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I thought we were doomed, but then it steadied, casting just enough light to guide us through the twisting maze of trees. The forest seemed alive now, shifting and groaning around us. The crunching sound returned, louder and more insistent, as though the trees themselves were moving, their roots and branches grinding together like bone on bone. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every breath felt like inhaling ash. We didn't stop running until we couldn't hear the crunching anymore. When we finally collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, the silence returned, oppressive and suffocating. Mandy was shaking uncontrollably, her hands clutching at the damp earth as though it might anchor her to reality. Dylan sat beside her, his head in his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat was dry, and my mind was spinning. All I could think about was Luis, how he had looked, how he had sounded, how the forest had taken him and turned him into whatever that was. And then I realized something. The voice, the one that had been following us, calling for help, it hadn't been Luis's voice after all. It had been something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting in this forest long before we arrived. As I sat there, trying to process what we'd just seen, I heard it again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A voice, calling out from the shadows. This time, it was Mandy's voice. Dylan and I froze, staring at each other as Mandy's voice drifted toward us from the darkness. She was right there with us, crumpled on the ground, trembling like a leaf. And yet, there it was. The same flat, empty tone we'd heard before. Help, it called. Please, help me. Mandy gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. No, she whimpered. That's not me. That's not me. The voice repeated itself, closer this time, and something in it had changed, an edge of malice, like it was mocking us. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as Dylan shot to his feet, yanking me up with him. We have to keep moving, he said, his voice low and strained. If we stay here, whatever it is, it'll take us too. Mandy shook her head violently. I can't, she sobbed. I can't go back out there. It's everywhere. It's... Mandy, listen to me. Dylan grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His flashlight beam flickered again, casting strange, jagged shadows across his face. You have to keep going. Do you understand me? If you stay here, it'll come for you. And you saw what it did to Luis. The mention of Luis seemed to snap her out of her panic. Her breathing steadied, just barely, and she nodded, though her eyes were still wild with fear. Without another word, Dylan turned and started walking, his flashlight cutting through the dense, suffocating darkness. I followed close behind, dragging Mandy with me, her hand cold and clammy in mine. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the pale, bone-like trees looming over us like silent sentinels. The ground beneath our feet felt alive, shifting and writhing as if something just beneath the surface was waiting to break through. Every step was torture, every sound a potential threat. The crunching, the whispering, the distant echoes of our own voices, there was no escaping it. The forest was alive, and it wanted us to know we were trespassing. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different from the last. The trees here were smaller, more tightly packed, their branches twisted together like gnarled hands. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk so white it seemed to glow in the dim light. Its bark was smooth and seamless, like polished bone, and its roots spread out in every direction, tangled and pulsing. Dylan shone the flashlight on the tree, and we saw them. Faces. Hundreds of faces, etched into the bark, their features frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Some were so detailed it was as if they'd been carved by a master sculptor, while others were warped and distorted, their mouths stretched open in silent screams. "What the hell is this place?" Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on one of the faces, a face I knew all too well. Luis. His mouth was open, his eyes wide with fear, and for a moment, I thought I saw his lips move. "Help," he whispered, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. Mandy let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward, but the roots seemed to move beneath her feet, tangling around her ankles and pulling her down. Dylan lunged for her, grabbing her arms and yanking her free, but the roots didn't stop. They writhed and twisted, reaching for all of us, like skeletal fingers clawing at the earth. "We need to go," I shouted, my voice breaking with panic. "Now." But before we could move, the ground beneath us began to shake. The massive tree groaned, its branches creaking like ancient bones, and the faces on its trunk seemed to shift, their mouths opening and closing in unison. A low, guttural sound filled the air, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in my chest. The flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, plunging us into darkness. Mandy screamed, and I felt her hand slip out of mine as the roots closed in around us. Dylan was shouting something, but his words were drowned out by the deafening hum, which was growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The hum, the shaking, the movement, all of it ceased, leaving us in an eerie, suffocating silence. I opened my eyes, though I wasn't sure when I'd closed them. The clearing was gone. The tree was gone. Dylan and Mandy were gone. I was standing alone in the middle of the forest, the pale, bone-like trees stretching endlessly in every direction. For a moment, I thought I was dead. But then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling out from the darkness. "Help," it said. "Please, help me." It was my own voice.